Hi, Laura. Thanks for joining me today. To start, do you want to maybe just take a minute to quickly introduce yourself?
Yeah, sure. So my name's Laura Thompson, and basically my career obsession is turning innovations into viable companies. So spent almost a decade at Google, got to launch radical innovations like self-driving cars and delivery drones as part of X, and then dove into the startup world first as an investor at Google Ventures, and then most recently building the ExxonDeck community. And really kind of throughout my career, have worked with hundreds of companies, big and small, on go to market and user discovery and building sort of experiment led companies.
Awesome overview. And I actually wanted to start a little bit earlier. So I saw during college, you actually started a company called Runa, which made clean energy drinks. I was kind of curious, like, what did you learn from that experience?
Yeah, so I started Runa with four friends in what was at the time really the only entrepreneurship class at Brown. And our professor, Danny Warshay, who's still an amazing friend and mentor, was obsessed with user discovery and user research and getting out of the building. And so I would say my biggest lesson from Runa was falling in love with the power of user discovery. We had my memories of that. We were like getting kicked out of Whole Foods multiple times for loitering in the aisles and asking people questions. We actually flew to Ecuador and did this crazy multi-day hike. I ended up in the ER in Quito, but that's a longer story. But that was like to build the first partnerships with the Quechua people and to kind of get it off the ground. So I think, since then I've worked with tons of companies around user discovery, and I always get pushback on we don't have time, or Ford said people would have wanted faster horses. But I think the reality is that if you want to create something that's really innovative, you don't need to create necessarily what your users ask you to, but you do need to really deeply understand the psychology and needs of the people that you're building it for. And that was super key to Runa's success. And also kind of doing that hard work up front, I think, was key to everything else I've done since then.
Yeah. And then after you graduated from Brown, you started your career at Google. Kind of curious, like, what influenced that decision?
Yeah, so two things. One was I knew that I couldn't stay with Runa. We had some good momentum, but actually two of the original five folks stayed. And I had come from very humble beginnings, to say the least. By the time I graduated college, I had lost both my parents. I was fully financially supporting myself. There was no safety net. And I think, the reality is if you have some co-founders in that position and some not, it's just not going to work. So I knew I had to get a job.
Yeah.
And then two was I think like many college kids that don't know what they want to do, was very focused on consulting.
Mhm.
And so I actually, at the time, Google was kind of a weird thing. It wasn't like a common career path. And I applied for Google because the interviews I thought would be good practice because they were the week before my McKinsey final round interview. Um, and then when you get the job offers, they fly you out for Sell Weekend. And I was super impressed with like the intelligence at Bain and McKinsey, but I got to Google and it was just like mind blowing, the obsession around impact at scale.
Mhm.
And I got to trail around Jason Toff, who's had an amazing career, unsurprisingly, since then. He was a year ahead of me, and he had basically like come up with and launched this whole program by himself. And I just, they had to like pull me off campus at the end of the weekend. I was just like, this is it. I'm in.
Yeah. And then after a few years working as a product marketing manager, you eventually found yourself at X, which was Alphabet's Moonshot Factory. And I think X had just started. I think you joined in 2013. It started in 2010. I'm kind of curious because I've only worked at startups, and on my Twitter feed, I see a lot of people that criticize big companies that try to innovate. And I
Yep.
would, yeah, just very curious about your perspective because the Moonshot Factory seems like it's been successful. I mean, they've launched a number of businesses. A lot of them have become standalone businesses. Like, what do you think Google got right when they were setting up X, and what can maybe like large companies learn from them in terms of just like how to innovate?
I think the biggest thing that X did well was incentives.
Mhm.
So if you ask most people, do they want to work on something really innovative that's high risk, where you're going to fail and be encouraged to experiment? People will nod their heads vigorously, like they're in.
Mhm.
But the reality is that failure is really painful and we're hugely conditioned to avoid it. And
Mhm.
so, I think X was very thoughtful about that early on, that we need to basically remind people over and over and over and demonstrate that we're serious about, we want you to experiment, we want you to fail. Like, you're not going to be dinged for it. We're actually going to celebrate it. And
Yeah.
so from sort of little, on a small scale, we did things like we used to call early drafts of documents V0.crap to encourage people to share their ideas as early as possible. And we had these like crumpled paper stickers that you would get if you killed an idea, that were like badges of honor for your laptop. And then on a bigger scale, actually, for all the projects that I got to launch there, I think the thing that I'm most proud of is that I led one of the first big shutdowns for X.
Mhm.
And essentially, the team themselves decided to shut their own project down. We sort of gave them a structure to think about it. And we gave everybody a big bonus, and we had a big party, and we helped all of them find new jobs. So I think the thing that companies, the difference between sort of companies that say that they want to innovate and the ones that really do, I think, is almost exclusively incentives.
Mhm. Cool. And then I was also curious because X builds projects outside of like Google's like initial products, and so they don't actually have like that built-in distribution.
Yeah.
I feel like that is a big risk when they set it up, but it ended up working. Can you talk more about maybe some of the challenges and advantages of like that set that X had, and maybe like what are some things that you would have done differently, reflecting now on all your experience there?
Yeah. I mean, I think the thing with X is, it's funny, they're like 13 plus years in at this point, but it still feels, it was a long term, it was always meant to be a long term bet. And so I feel like in many ways, like the jury is still out on whether this model works.
Yeah.
And I think being separate from Google was very helpful in that it gave, you need most people at a company, whether big or small, to be working on something that has like a reasonable chance of success. And the stuff at X, by design doesn't. And so I think having us pretty separate was very useful. I think in terms of, actually the earliest X project did end up getting moved into Google. It was Google Brain. It's the basis for a lot of the AI work at Google right now. But then, yeah, I do think like that it was quite hard with some of the early projects. I worked a lot on Wing, which is a drone delivery company. And it was, people were sort of wary about like, why is a Google affiliated thing working on this? And, I think there were definitely pros and cons. And, the reality is like, it'll take another 5-10 years to figure out if that was the right call.
Yeah, makes sense. And then while you were at X, you delivered more than like 100 plus speeches and presentations to executives and leaders about the things that you were learning while working there. I was kind of curious of like, what were the key topics or findings that you were sharing during those presentations?
Yeah, man, there were a lot. I think that one theme that came up a ton was, I think, the idea of measuring success by your units of learning. And so the reality at X was that most of the things that we worked on were not going to work out. And so our success was really tied to how quickly we could figure out that something wasn't going to work, whether due to tech or regulation or the laws of physics, and move on to the next thing. So it was really important that we worked on the hardest parts first, so that we'd learn that as fast as possible. And Astro Teller, who's the head of X, had this very memorable analogy that we came to call sort of the monkey first principle, where he would say, if you were going to teach a monkey to recite Shakespeare while standing on a pedestal, please do not start by building the pedestal. So we talked a lot at X about, like, how are we doing monkey first here, and what is the hardest part of the problem? And I think the reality is like that's true for sort of just about anything. There's a huge upside for people who are willing to learn the hardest lesson first. whether in life or career, startups or big companies.
Makes sense. And then one of your most recent stops in your career was at a startup called ExxonDeck, and that's actually where I met you. And ExxonDeck was a startup building communities for talented and ambitious people, and you started the Execs on Deck program there. Kind of curious, like, while you were working with these executives who were trying to figure out what they wanted to do in their careers, or some maybe like exercises or frameworks that you were using to help guide these individuals.
Yeah, I mean, so I started ExxonDeck basically to solve my own problem, which was when I left Google, I jumped into sort of startup exec roles. I found that I really loved the intensity and the pace and the mission, but I really missed having a peer community to learn from. And I found that there were a ton of communities and resources for founders, but there's really nothing for senior leaders in startups who, any founder can tell you can be pretty make or break.
Yeah.
And so the idea with Execs on Deck was to bring together hundreds of the top, sort of best in class leaders from around the world. And we had coaching and resources, but most importantly, I think the sort of peer community of people to ask things of. So in terms of like frameworks and resources, I think that, the reality was like the 99.9% of the benefit was that it was a place where people could talk about anything. So, starting an LLC for consulting on the side, hiring, firing, where to go on vacation, how to make time to take a vacation, really anything. And I think that we saw one of the earliest things that people struggled with was how to kind of leverage and make time for community. Fellows came in with killer networks already, and then they were joining this like hundreds of other people that were keen to network and build community. But it's really hard with like a big job and a busy life to make the time. So something we did right up front, actually based on something I've been doing for a million years, is I have a calendar hold for 15 minutes every single Friday with myself called Touch Base. And I use that time to reach out to someone that I just like randomly, that I just haven't talked to in a long time. There's no ask, there's no like specific goal. It's just an opportunity for me to sort of really reconnect with someone that, I want to keep in touch with.
Yeah.
And so there's something that I shared with them. And I think that starting with sort of like adding a small amount of structure to how do you leverage your community, both inside and outside of Execs on Deck. And I think similarly, that idea of like adding small structure to things that are sort of nebulous, like career development and job hunt. So something we talked a lot about within EOD was, doing like one thing for your job hunt a week, committing to like a coaching session or a workshop or, one touch point with someone as a way to, and same for, career development, as a way to make sort of what felt like more linear progress out of what are inherently, messy, non-linear processes.
Yeah. And then kind of curious, when you think about the executive job hunt, what is something that's maybe like underutilized today that you think more executives should take advantage of when they're doing that? Is it career coaching? Is it just finding a group, community of peers? Is it something else? Like, what's the number one thing that you're recommending to those people?
I think the number one unlock for exec job hunting, and like this is maybe a hot take, but like I will stand by this all day and night, is storytelling.
Hmm.
So the reality is most people are pretty terrible, understandably, at telling their own story. And especially for execs, because you've had a much longer career and done hopefully like an interesting mix of things. And I think especially for execs who want to pivot, which many of them do because they want a steep learning curve again, it's just very hard to get good at telling your story. And I think, you can do that by practicing with peers, you can do it with a coach. So like sort of the solution can be any number of things. But I think that getting really serious about absolutely killing your sort of storytelling piece is the unlock for most execs.
Cool. And then I wanted to finish with just 3 very broad questions to close us out. So one of the reasons I reached out to you, 1, you're like very accomplished, and 2, you've had a variety of different perspectives. So you've worked at X, which is this larger company. You've worked at startups. You've founded your own company. You've invested. You've advised. So you've kind of run the whole gamut. But kind of curious, like looking back at your career, which has been just like the most enjoyable and exciting for you?
Yeah, I think if you ask a bunch of people sort of what the best moment in their career was, they will inevitably tell you, they'll describe a time where they were part of a small high trust team that was working really hard on something that was big and meaningful, or, you know, even seemed sort of potentially impossible. And I think I was really lucky in that my career North Star, really since I graduated college, has been maximizing my time in those moments.
Yeah.
And because I had that clarity, I was able to sort of pursue this, you know, to your point, like a wide mix of opportunities, and see things from a lot of different angles, and kind of ignore some of the stuff I didn't care about as much around like job title and big versus small and whatever. So I would say, you know, I don't know that there's like a specific team. You know, the early days of X were certainly like particularly sort of magical and unique, but I also feel that way about Runa, and even like the early days of ExxonDeck. So I think it's more like that moment of, you know, building something new with really smart people that you feel is important.
Yeah. And then I think at least when I think about my career and when I think a lot of other people think about their careers, they try to find the balance between career trajectory, compensation, and finding something that you enjoy doing. I think it's very hard to find all three of those aspects. Kind of curious, like, have you gone about trying to balance those things at various points in your career?
It's a good question. I think my focus in my career has really been on work that is meaningful. I think I've been a little bit less worried about trajectory and other things, maybe for better or worse. I think that one thing that's worth noting is, you know, I've always been a bit of a personal finance geek. I
Yeah.
taught personal finance workshops actually for like 10 plus years. I've taught at all the big tech companies, and lots of startups. And, you know, I think because I came from humble beginnings, I was very focused on it. And so, you know, when I was at Google, the first probably 6 or 7 years of my career, I lived on less than 20% of my income and invested the other 80. Now it would be sort of fire movement or whatever. At the time, people just thought I was really, really weird. And the, you know, it's impossible to talk about money without talking about like privilege and luck, and like, yes, Google stock did well and that was helpful and all this stuff. But, you know, I think one thing that I talk to people about, if you don't, it is kind of like that, getting that right early in your career and kind of having that discipline early, getting into investing, things like that, I think buys you a lot more freedom, even if it's not huge amounts of money, just due to compounding, and is like a huge way to sort of buy your own freedom to create a career you're really excited about.
Yeah. Makes sense. I wish I got into personal finance way sooner. I think I started only like 3 years ago, but I should have known this in college, or I wish I took a class that kind of opened my eyes to just how important it is to start early. So love that
And the
advice.
reality is like, it's never too late. I mean,
Yeah.
I still do I took the CFP classes over, I didn't end up taking the exam, but like just to have the knowledge over COVID. And I still do a ton of informal counseling around personal finance. And, you know, I think people are surprised because in Silicon Valley, we talk so much about lottery tickets and like big exits and being employee number 3 at Facebook and whatever. But the reality is, for most people, you can buy yourself like a good amount of freedom by just being kind of like diligent about it, you know, over a chunk of time.
Yeah, makes sense. And then last question, what is some career advice that you learned along the way that still resonates with you today?
I I think a lot about consistency and the value of compounding. So I actually just wrote something about this on LinkedIn the other day. Years ago, I had just started in VC, and I was at dinner with a colleague, Tyson Clark, who's an amazing VC, who's since passed away, unfortunately. And I was basically ranting to him about how frustrated I was at seeing all of the VC dollars go to essentially white men. And that I was like seeing this up close and I couldn't do anything about it, and like just how incredibly infuriating it was. And his advice at the time, which I kind of rolled my eyes about, was he was like, look, you and I are not going to be able to change the system, but at least what you can do is sort of commit to a small, repeatable action that will make things 1% better over the long term. And I ended up taking his advice, and I committed to doing like 2 to 3 calls with diverse leaders on every single week on things that I could help with. So like go to market, storytelling to raise money, and kind of navigating nonlinear careers were the 3 things I picked. And I realized the other week I've been doing that for 7 years. I've kept that promise for 7 years. And I was talking to somebody, and I ended up looking at my like Google Doc where I keep notes, and it's 150 pages long. From those conversations, I've had more than 600 conversations, and I've just gotten so much out of it. Like I've met so many interesting people. It gives me just this endless supply of anecdotes that I can use in my work. It's just been really meaningful. And so I think, lives and careers, something people forget is like lives and careers are hopefully quite long. And I think we tend to overemphasize hacks and underemphasize sort of the power of doing things consistently that compound.
Yeah, I love that advice. It's also just something that I've been thinking about every day, is like half the battle is just showing up every day and getting a little bit better. And over the long run, that's going to pay off. And so just, thinking long term about your career, I think is super important for everyone out there. But yeah, thank you so much, Laura, for joining me. I really enjoyed this.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. It was fun.